Hello, and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast, where you can learn powerful techniques to change the way you feel. I am your host, Rhonda Borowski, and joining me here in the Murrieta studio is Dr. David Burns. Dr. David Burns is a pioneer in the development of cognitive behavioral therapy and the creator of the new teen therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 30 languages. David is currently an emeritus adjunct professor of clinical psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine.
Hello, Rhonda.
Bonjour, David, in honor of Fabrice. Bonjour. And welcome to our listeners to episode 139. Today, we're going to talk about, I think, a very interesting topic, bibliotherapy, or can a self-help book really help, or are our self-help books just hype?
Yeah, this is kind of a really fun and interesting topic. When I read Feeling Good, I never thought of it as being a self-help book.
When you wrote Feeling Good?
Well, when I wrote it too. When I first read it, it was remarkable. When I wrote it, my rationale, I was not thinking of writing a book that would sell a lot of copies. I was thinking of writing something maybe I could make 100 copies and give it to patients to read between sessions, because there's a lot of psychoeducation and cognitive therapy, things that every patient needs to learn, like cognitive distortions and self-defeating beliefs and how to identify negative thoughts. And then there's the part where you individualize it for every patient. So I was just thinking to just take the common components there and put them into a book or an extended handout that I could give to patients, so that I wouldn't have to talk so much, saying the same things every session, and they could pick up the basics in the book.
So was your idea that the patients would read this handout in between sessions?
Yeah. That's how I thought of it. And then I was able, with a lot of effort and rejection, to find a publisher and eventually get it published, and eventually, it caught on. After it was 8 years before it went up on the bestseller lists after it had been released. But at any rate,
I mean, it was released and then 8 years later it was on the bestseller list?
Yeah, it took 8 years because the publisher wouldn't support it because they thought it had no potential. And I'm actually running into the same thing now with my new book, Feeling Great. All the people I used to work with have left the publishers. I'm working with new people I don't know, and they're saying, "Who's this guy? Oh gosh, we don't want another book like this." So it's a struggle again to find a publisher who wants to publish it. I think I will find someone, though. It looks beginning to look brighter in the last week or two. But at any rate, I got it published, and they would they print a few thousand, it would sell out, they wouldn't notice that it sold out, then they'd print a few more thousand. But what happened is I started getting letters from people. This was before email, and people who had read it, who had said, this book really helped me. And that amazed me, because a lot of them were saying it had helped them even without therapy. And I didn't concentrate too much on that, but I was definitely, a lot of people were telling me this, and they were saying, "Oh boy, the book Feeling Good helped me." Even I'd had electroconvulsive therapy, it didn't help, and I'd taken every known antidepressant, it didn't help, and I read your book, and it changed my life. And to tell you the truth, I to this day, I get emails now like that, I would say pretty much every single day. And I don't know if I've gotten 10,000 emails like that or 50,000, but it's some enormous number.
That's so moving to hear. That someone could go through electroconvulsive shock therapy and not get better, go through medication and not get better.
And have years of psychotherapy and not get better.
Yeah. But I think one of the strengths of your book is you don't just read it passively. There are exercises that you follow.
Yeah, right.
And, it's an active process reading your book.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And that's what I was trying to push the reader to do, but it was more thinking the reader was going to be in therapy while they're doing these exercises. It hadn't occurred to me that people might try doing them on their own. And then one day it was actually 1988 or 89, someone said, "Did you see that feature article about your book in the New York Times.
And you hadn't seen it?
No, and I didn't know anything about it. And so they gave me the article, and I was glad I didn't know this was going on, because I would have been so nervous. But a psychologist at University of Alabama, Dr. Forrest Scogan, a research psychologist, had been doing research on the book Feeling Good.
Interesting.
And he wanted to see if it had any antidepressant properties.
And he didn't call you in advance to ask your permission?
No, I didn't know a single thing about it till I saw this thing in the New York Times. And also they were thinking about, because medical care is so expensive, if a self-help book could help somebody, that would have scientific implications, because we could be prescribing a book as the first treatment, because there's no side effects. It's very inexpensive. But I think we've all been suspicious of self-help books. And as I say, I never thought of it as a self-help book.
Right, because I don't want to find out that I live on Venus or Mars.
Yeah, exactly. It's stupid, silly stuff. And I kind of look down on people who write self-help books. I think they're frauds, almost all of them. But I'm a cynic. But when I pick up these books in bookstores and I read a sentence or two, I want to vomit, kind of. You can just tell the phony tone. At least to me, it's like that. So I always thought it was a bad genre, kind of a low-life kind of deal.
Geez, how interesting that you thought the genre was a low-life, yet you entered it wholeheartedly.
Well, but as I say, I was not thinking of the book as a self-help book. I just wanted to write a book about this new therapy that I was so excited about. And I wrote it as a therapy accelerator, is the way I was.
Oh, I love that. Therapy accelerator.
Yeah. But at any rate, he had done this study where he took, I think, 80 patients, and these were older people who came to the University of Alabama seeking treatment for major depressive disorder, moderate to severe. And he told them, you're going to have to be on a waiting list for 4 weeks before you can see the psychiatrist for medication or psychotherapy or both. But in the meanwhile, read this book. And he gave them one of two books, my book, Feeling Good, or some of them got Peter Lewinson's book, Up from Depression. And then half the patients, and it was random, got no book to read. And then they tested the patients in these two groups, the 40 who got the self-help book and the 40 who were just on the waiting list. And every week they measured their moods using the Beck Depression Inventory, and I think they also gave them the Hamilton Depression Inventory to see if there would be any change in any of the patients. And they reported that at the end of the 4 weeks, 2/3 of the patients that they'd given one of these self-help books to had actually recovered so much that they no longer wanted or needed treatment.
Oh,
and that was spectacular, and the people on the waiting list had not improved statistically. Then they did a kind of an A-B type design. They took the people who hadn't recovered.
From the waiting list?
Yeah, from the first 4 weeks who hadn't had the book, and said, as it turns out, you have to wait another 4 weeks, but in the meanwhile, read this book. And they gave them a copy of my book, Feeling Good, and then to wait and see what happened. And then 4 weeks later, 2/3 of them had also recovered and no longer wanted or needed treatment. And so they published this in a medical journal called The Gerontologist, and it made quite a splash. And it was a peer refereed, research study. It wasn't some fly on the wall thing. Certainly nothing I had anything to do with. And then I think the National Institute of Mental Health, where he was getting, I think, his grant money, said that this could have been a placebo effect, because maybe any book would have that effect. Just the fact that you're reading something and, your depression gets better. So they asked him to do another study with younger people and to give half of them a placebo book and half of them Feeling Good. And then to say, how many get better? And they selected Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, which is a very popular book, also a little about thinking and attitudes, and had to do with concentration camp survivors. And then, so they did this one, and then they did the second study. They published in another high-powered psychology journal, and I have the references on the show notes on my website. I have all of these references, 11 papers that they published. But the people who read the Viktor Frankl book did not improve. But again, 2/3 of the people who they gave the book Feeling Good to recovered and did not want or need further treatment. So they published that, and then people raised the question, will the effects last? And so they did a 2-year study and a 3-year study, follow-up study, of the patients and they called this bibliotherapy or reading therapy.
So that's where the name came, bibliotherapy?
Yeah, that's where it came from. And their conclusion was that it's not the reading, like any book won't do. It has to be a book that has good messages and good techniques that will actually be helpful for people. But then again, the same question is, will it last? So they did first a 2-year follow-up. And I think this was in the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology, one of the highest level research journals. And they reported in the follow-up studies that the patients didn't tend to relapse during that time. In fact, their mood scores, on average, the mean depression level was even better than at the end of the original 4 weeks.
Oh my gosh.
But the patients didn't say they were happy all the time, but they just said when they got upset, as we all do, they would grab the book off the shelf and turn to the pages that had been helpful to them and read those pages again and then recovered again. And so that kind of put I think the whole concept of self-help books and reading therapy on the map as something that was scientifically valid. And I always thought it was kind of interesting because if you look at studies of antidepressants or psychotherapy, all forms of psychotherapy, none of them have ever reported a 2/3 recovery in 4 weeks.
That's correct.
But it's probably partially a placebo effect, but partially a specific effect. But it was very, very, very exciting to be sure.
Well, it kind of makes me wonder, why would someone go to a therapist and not just pick up one of these books, one of your books?
Well, you could argue that, and David Antonuccio, a research psychologist in Reno, who's a buddy, has been giving a lot of lectures on the treatment of depression. He was one of the people who showed that the drugs called antidepressants have no real antidepressant effects aside from their placebo effects. He's been kind of looking at that literature and writing research articles on the failure of antidepressants. But he recommends that physicians in general practice get out their prescription pad and put a prescription for the book Feeling Good and hand that to patients rather than an antidepressant. Use that as a first line of treatment because it's very inexpensive. In fact, when Forrest Kogan was doing his research, he was able to buy copies of Feeling Good in paperback for $2.40 a piece. So it's way cheaper. And, and it's such a crime the way they charge so much money for these treatments that are ineffective. It seems cruel. I heard on the news in the last week, in fact, in my new book, one of the opening chapters is a treatment of someone with postpartum depression, again, in a single session.
I saw that article. They're charging $35,000.
Yeah, to give some kind of infusion to have some reduction in depression levels. I'm not against a medication that works and that's effective, but it just seems cruel. That's perhaps for another day, but to charge some exploitative amount of money, I just think we need national health insurance and get rid of this conflict of interest and stop trying to make money off of people's suffering and depression and anxiety. Well,
David, when is a self-help book good standing on its own, and when is it useful as a supplement to therapists' work?
Well, I don't think that's really known. My own, thinking is if it doesn't do it for you, at least you'll learn some stuff, and then you can go to a therapist who can maybe give you a more powerful and individualized kind of intervention. But I am not trying to put human therapists out of business at all, just to accelerate recovery for people who who want to recover, and we don't even know why a book like Feeling Good helps people. I think the list of 10 distortions has been helpful to people. I think that my own opinion is talking about some of my own personal issues, the times I cried and felt lost, and how I turn things around for myself, I think is helpful. I think that the exercises are helpful, but also there's a motivation component there, because if you read the book and do the exercises, that's tapping into and amplifying your own motivation for recovery. And I think that's in part how they work too.
Right, exactly. There are some schools of therapy or psychology or that say the relationship between the patient and the client is the most important thing. And what you're talking about is the work that someone does, with the exercises, the reading, their motivation is equally as important, or maybe more important.
I think all of these things can be important. And one of the neat things about writing a book like Feeling Good is the chance to be truly empathic. Because I'm not the easiest guy to get along with, to be honest. I can be overly aggressive, but when I write that book, I create a synthetic David who's terribly warm and empathic. And I would say half the people who wrote me, I've had 25,000 letters and emails of people say, "Oh, you were so empathic. I knew you were talking to me. You're the only one who ever understood me." So a self-help book actually can be empathic. And I bet if there was a contest to compare Feeling Good to human therapists on who's the most empathic, I have no doubt Feeling Good could beat any of them.
No, but last week when we were talking about your work with Sherry, in that work we were emphasizing the importance of empathy and the therapeutic relationship and the trust to encourage her and allow her to be willing to do, for example, exposure work.
Yeah.
So you can't get, as beautiful as this book is, and I use it as with homework all the time. With my clients, you can't get that kind of therapeutic relationship with the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And that human connection is incredibly important and valuable. And my only problem is that, I have this empathy scale, which you use in your work. And when therapists, we require patients to rate the therapist on empathy, on the therapeutic relationship at the end of every session. And these people who were talking about how important the therapeutic relationship is, they're not using my scale.
Absolutely not.
Or most of them aren't using any scale.
Right.
And when therapists use my scale for the first time, almost all of them find they get failing grades from almost every patient at almost every session. So to me, it's kind of like a joke that these people who are crusading for the therapeutic relationship, I'll bet you $1 to a dime, they have crappy therapeutic relationships with virtually all their patients or nearly all their patients, and they don't even know it. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that's harsh about team therapy, but also liberating, is when you get those ratings from patients and you see you're failing, you can process that with the patient and transform the therapeutic relationship. And that's what's been helpful for me too. Because when I started out, my empathy skills were not good. And I got slammed by a lot of patients, and I didn't want to get slammed. And so I developed and learned the 5 secrets of effective communication. And so the therapy I do now is a high art form compared with where I started out 30 or 40 years ago.
Well, the other really important thing about bibliotherapy in your book in particular is there aren't team therapists everywhere.
Yeah.
But you can buy your book almost anywhere. Through Amazon or anything, you can get it. Now it's in 30 different languages.
Sure.
So if someone is in an area where there's not a therapist, or there's not a therapist they want to work with, or they can't afford therapy because it can be awfully expensive, and you talked about our insurance policies in this country. Insurance often doesn't pay for mental health therapy. So being able to pick up a book and have the opportunity that 2/3 of the readers will get better is really empowering. Yeah,
and that little book still got legs. I was telling you earlier, almost every week or two, it gets sold in yet another country. We just, this last week, got an inquiry from Albania. A group in Albania wants to translate it and publish it, and just it's going all over the world. I wanted to mention that, and it's so gratifying because I was going to, as I say, my original plan was to just print up 100 copies myself and hand it out to patients. I had no idea that it would have the kind of impact that it's had.
But, you know, Feeling Good isn't the only book you've written. That book is about people with depression or anxiety, right?
Yeah.
Haven't you written books on just, you know, When Panic Attacks is a great book for people who are focusing on anxiety disorders. And my personal favorite is Feeling Good Together on relationship problems.
Yeah.
And
that's a good one. If you go to the show notes on my website, feelinggood.com, I have a table for about 7 or 8 of my books and what they're good for. You can look in the table, but for depression, Feeling Good is probably the best. The Feeling Good Handbook is also extremely effective for both depression and all of the anxiety disorders. If you've got any kind of anxiety, probably the book When Panic Attacks is the book to read. As you mentioned, if it's a relationship problem, Feeling Good Together, and that's about the most challenging area. It's harder to solve relationship problems than it is to recover from depression or anxiety because the resistance is so intense. And we've been focusing on that, as you know, in our Tuesday training group at Stanford and a lot in my Sunday hikes. In fact, we had someone in the hike this last Sunday who has been fighting against using the 5 secrets with his significant other, I would say, for 3 years.
wow.
Insisting that the 5 secrets won't work and he shouldn't have to use it. And he's all for truth and arguing and defending himself. And he had a breakthrough finally on the Sunday hike, and he suddenly saw how he was forcing his significant other to be hostile and angry with him and to be critical of him. And it was stunning when he said it was a true enlightenment. And then he suddenly became humble, and he's learning now to use the 5 secrets. It was so moving. And then finally, a book which I have to redo. Angela Crum from the Feeling Good Institute has offered to redo it when she gets a little time. It's kind of dated, and there's some things in it that have to be changed. But it's about hustling. About, like, if you're lonely and don't know how to make friends, or you're horny and you're chasing people and getting rejected, this book will show you how to turn the tables and get people chasing after you in unlimited quantities.
I don't like the way you describe that. It's about dating problems and how to create relationships. You're talking about your book,
No, it's not about how to create
Connections.
relationships. It's about how to play the dating game and to win. It has nothing to do with developing meaningful relationships. And anyone trying to develop meaningful relationships probably can get screwed in the dating world. But it's how to win that game. Now, once you find someone and win, and find someone you want to marry, then you need the book Feeling Good Together to learn how to develop meaningful relationships. All the whole Intimate Connections will do is show you how to make people chase after you and lust after you. But for that
sounds good too.
That's very important. And I've had so many people came to me at workshops say, "God bless you, Dr. Burns. I used to be such a loser, and now I'm married thanks to your book, Intimate Connections."
Wow.
So
That's high praise.
yeah. So anything else on bibliotherapy?
There's so much good to say about it. No, nothing else. I just encourage people to read the books.
And if you read them, do the exercises. If you read Feeling Good Together about relationship conflicts, well, it says this in the book of, I don't remember if it's in the Hebrew scriptures or in the New Testament. It says, do the effing written exercises while you're reading. Otherwise, you're not going to understand the book. It's very simple, but you won't understand it without the written exercises and Feeling Good Together. And because it shows you how you're creating your own interpersonal reality. And so if you have someone who's overly critical of you, you're forcing them to criticize you.
And I just want to also add that if a therapist is going to use these books for homework assignments, it would be really helpful if they read them first and did all the exercises too.
Oh, yeah. So with that, we'll make this a little short podcast. I think it's been, but the last 2 were long, so we'll reward people with a short one.
It's, again, a blessing to have been part of it.
So thank you, Rhonda.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this episode under the podcast page. You will also find archives of previous episodes and many resources for therapists and non-therapists. We welcome your comments and questions. If you want to support the show, please share the podcast with people who might benefit from it. You could also go to iTunes and leave a 5-star rating. The theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Rhonda Borowski. We hope you enjoyed this episode. I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good Podcast.